to next introduce Judge David Stearns. He's a husband, a father, grandfather. Stevens. I'm sorry, I said Stearns. Wow. Judge David Stevens. He's a husband, father, grandfather, Superior Court judge, and Navy veteran. After graduating from high school, David joined the Navy and served on the USS Camden in Bremerton, Washington as a fire control technician, second class. During his service, he saw what true lack of opportunity looks like and learned firsthand why America is the greatest country in the world. During his service, he was awarded 2 Good Conduct Medals, a Meritorious Unit Citation, Armed Forces Expeditionary Medal, and the Armed Forces Expeditionary Medal was for service during Operation Earnest Will. After finishing his Navy enlistment, David received an honorable discharge. The Navy taught him self-discipline and how to serve with honor. Using the Veterans Education Assistance Program, he went to the University of Washington and earned a bachelor's degree of arts in focusing on race and ethnic relations. He was first in his extended family to get a college degree. While getting his college degree was one of his and his parents' dreams, the most important thing he did at the University of Washington was meet his future wife, Pamela Zerr. Pam had her bachelor's degree in linguistics from the University of Washington and is an honorably discharged Navy veteran as well. After graduating from UW, David worked for the Department of Housing and Urban Development as a federal civil rights investigator in the Fair Housing Enforcement Center in Seattle. He was originally hired under the Outstanding Scholar Program. He made sure that people weren't denied housing because of their race, religion, family status, or disability. Working at HUD gave him a passion for fighting for what's right. David then went to the University of Washington School of Law. He did well and was awarded the Mary Ellen Krug Scholarship for the law student showing exceptional promise in litigation. UW Law knew that David would be a trial attorney. After graduating, David went on to be the chief public defender for the Colville Confederated Tribes, a senior deputy prosecutor for the Mason County Prosecutor's Office, a special assistant U.S. attorney, federal prosecutor in the Eastern District of California, and an international prosecutor in Pristina, Kosovo, and a justice advisor in Afghanistan. In November of 2023, Judge David Stevens was overwhelmingly elected to Mason County Superior Court. He defeated the incumbent who had been appointed by then-Governor Jay Inslee, and in 2024, he was reelected. Judge Stevens is currently a candidate for Washington State Supreme Court Justice Position 3. So please make a warm welcome for Judge David Stevens.
So it should surprise you the most is there's 2 good conduct medals. So, for one thing, I have to put it on the record, I am not here to support a partisan position, okay, because that would get me in trouble with the Judicial Conduct Commission. Here on my own campaign back. But I'm going to talk a little bit about my experience with law enforcement. But first I'm going to say, Dan, you were the one that talked me into running for judge.
You're welcome, Judge.
So you should be held accountable. Because I'm about holding people accountable. So, 37 years ago, I had an interview scheduled with the Seattle Police Department to be a police officer. And boy, was I nervous. Because I didn't know if I could do that kind of job. I mean, I just, to be a patrol officer in Seattle. But luckily, I got a call from the federal government. They offered me a job that paid more. So I did not go down that road. But I went to UW Law School, did well, like you just read. They knew I was going to be a trial attorney. So I wanted to do real estate law, because you know what? I thought there was some money in that. But then somebody offered me a job to be a prosecutor. And so I called my professor of criminal law, and she had been a public defender for King County. She was ultra liberal. She did not like me at all. Okay. I was president of the Federal Society in law school. That's the conservative group, conservative and libertarians. It's a debate society, so don't believe what they say in the newspapers. It's a secret cabal of conservative attorneys or anything like that. It's a debate. We actually, the Federal Society will get conservatives and liberals. They're the best in their field, and they'll argue things, and then we'll all listen to that. And they'll write law review articles and things like that. So she didn't like me. I got this job as a prosecutor. And I called her up and I said, how do you be a good prosecutor? And she was silent because she did not want to give me any advice. But she had some integrity. And she said, you know what? There's two things you got to do to be a good prosecutor. First, you have to go to trial. And I said, prosecutors always go to trial. That's what prosecutors are famous for. And she goes, no, prosecutors cut deals. That's all they are, is deal makers. They only go to trial when they have to go to trial. And I said, oh, okay. And then the second thing she said was, you have to do appeals. And I said, appeals? And she said, yeah, because there's things that happen in the trial court you'll never understand unless you do appeals. So when I became a prosecutor, I was determined to go to trial. And in my first 18 months as a prosecutor, I went to trial 25 times. Now, you don't have any context for that. But over the course of me being a prosecutor, I went to trial more than 200 times. 200 times I argued to a jury felony trials. Now, a hard-charging prosecutor that really wants to go to trial, if they've done 50, they're doing pretty good. If they've done 100, wow. If they've done 200, they develop a twitch that never goes away. And I've got that twitch. So I went to trial. And you know what? I got to work with law enforcement a lot. And people would always say, wow, Dave, you're so great at trial. And you know what? I always said, if law enforcement does a really good investigation, if they really document an investigation well, and then they investigate possible defenses. See, this is where I think law enforcement officers sometimes fall a little short. Because the defendant will make some outrageous claims or something like that. The law enforcement officer, he's at the scene, he sees what's going on, or she sees what's going on, and they know it's total BS. So they don't investigate it. But you know that defense attorney is going to make a lot of hay out of it. They're going to create reasonable doubt. Well, why didn't the officer investigate that? And so I was really lucky. I got to train some law enforcement officers. And I got really good at it. In fact, in Spokane, they created what they called the Repeat Offender Program. They got a federal grant, and so they identified the worst of the worst. I'm not talking about, I'm talking about the car thieves, the burglars, the ones where you could actually look at the neighborhoods that they were living in, and you could actually see when they were in jail, crime would go down in that neighborhood. And so they created this program, the rope program, and I always used to laugh because we're just giving them enough rope to hang themselves. And we went to trial. I used to joke that if you committed jaywalking, I'm sending you to prison. And they used to, and they gave me the nickname after a while of No Deal Dave. Because I said, they would say, the defense attorneys would say to me, well, we'll just take that to trial. And I would say, oh, we were always going to trial. We're always going to trial. The only way we're going to stop not going to trial is your client's going to plead as charged. Now, we can talk about all of the sentencing alternatives that are developed and things like that. And so that was my experience as law enforcement. And I developed a solid relationship with law enforcement. In fact, I knew that I had a solid relationship with law enforcement when they started inviting me to their barbecues, which are crazy, and to their weddings. And I really enjoyed that. But then I made the mistake of running as a Republican for Spokane County prosecutor because I didn't think it was fair that if you hit my desk, you were likely going to prison. You were going to be held accountable. You hit the desk of the prosecutor next to me, maybe you'd get a misdemeanor. You just plead it out. And I said, there's got to be some consistency. And so I ran for prosecutor. Obviously, I did not win that. And so then I became a public defender. And then, and I would tell my clients too, they would say, we hear you're really good. And I'd say, well, I'm only good if the prosecutor isn't. And so I started going to trial as a public defender, and I was winning way more cases than I should have. And there was this one prosecutor, and he'd say, I love going to trial against you, Dave, because I always learn things. And so we'd go have beers and cigars afterwards, and I'd tell him, this is what you should have done, man. This is how you should have prosecuted this case. And so I did that for a while, and then went to Afghanistan, lived there for a while, and we trained the judges and watched the corruption, and we knew that they weren't going to change their system. They were going to adopt a Western judicial system. And then I became a prosecutor, and I was seconded to the European Union as an international prosecutor in Kosovo. And I actually got a case to trial, which is very rare, and usually they're just doing paper exercises. I actually got it, and I won. I got in all the European press for winning the case. And so I get a call, and they want me to come back to the States. And so I ended up working for the Ute tribe in Vernal, Utah as their chief prosecutor. And I got a call from Mason County. And so Mason County, I put in an application like a couple of years before, and their senior deputy prosecutor was retiring, and they needed somebody who could do murder trials and rape trials and things like that. And so I went, my wife Pam over there, and I said, how would you like it if I made less money, worked a lot harder, was here all the time, and we lived on the west side, which is full of godless communists. And so Pam said, well, that doesn't sound so great. And I said, well, it is Mason County where our oldest daughter, Samantha, lives, and 3 grandchildren. And she said, take it. So I ended up in Mason County, just going about my job, prosecuting cases, building up a solid reputation as a guy who went to trial and held people accountable. And so, you know what really annoys me about a prosecutor is when a prosecutor tells me they've never lost a case. And you think, oh, wow, you must be really good. No, you never took chances. You never had cases where the evidence was there, but it was going to be really hard. And maybe you weren't going to get it. Or maybe it was a case that needed to be tried because it was a really bad guy with a terrible history. And you know what? I had guys who, I didn't even win the case, but they were so scared to death that somebody would actually hold them accountable, that they actually reform their ways. There's this one guy I prosecuted, and this is when drugs were illegal. So I'll talk to you a little bit about that in a minute. But, and you know what? He'd cut deals. And never did any time or anything like that. And I was like, nope, you don't get deals with no deal day. So I took him to trial. I got him convicted. And his name was Otto. And so about a year later, I'm walking into the courthouse, and I see him in line. He dressed distinctively, so you knew this guy. And I'm walking past him, and I just think to myself, Jesus, you're back. And I shouldn't have done this because I was a prosecutor, and if he was being prosecuted, you're not supposed to have personal contact with him. I turned around and I said, why are you here, Otto? And he said, you know what? You prosecuting me changed my entire life. Amen. You know what? I cut deals, and part of my probation was always to get drug treatment, but I just blew it off because they knew they weren't going to do anything about it. And then you did it, and you actually made them make me do it. And Mr. Stevens, I'm here to get a marriage license. And I went to his wedding. See, this is a weird thing about criminals. They do want to be held accountable. They think the system's a joke. And if we're not going to be serious and hold them accountable, then they are not going to change. But when you hold them accountable, the ones that can be saved will reform. We're all, I assume, we all believe in redemption. We can all change. You read your Bible, full of sinners that did God's work, that changed when God entered their life. People are capable of change. But you know what? I keep hearing from law enforcement, and it's true, that the jails have become basically mental health facilities now and stuff like that. But what happens when you incentivize people saying that they have a mental health problem, instead of saying, listen, you did this, you got to be held accountable for this, you got to either go to jail or you got to go to prison. Instead, we tell them, no. If you got a mental illness, no, we're not going to, no, we're going to get you treatment and stuff like that. So right now we have the mental health sentencing alternative. So if you committed a crime, the mandatory sentence is 5 years because you used a gun. And, wait, you've got a mental illness now that was undiagnosed? Yeah, I wonder how much of the situation we have with the drug problem and everything like that, when you incentivize people to say the reason they're doing everything they're doing is because of the drugs and because of mental illness. You're taking away their agency. You're saying, no, you can't be held accountable. It's not your fault. I wonder, maybe that's not a way we should go down. So let me tell you about why I'm running for state Supreme Court. I was a prosecutor during the meth epidemic, and I prosecuted a lot of cases. I mean, you wouldn't believe, literally thousands of cases. And the statute 6950, 401, had been before the state Supreme Court twice in the 40 years. In 40 years, it had been in front of the state Supreme Court, and they said, no, this is fine, this is fine. And then a few years ago in the Blake decision, they said, no, that we don't like the disparate impact that it has on minorities. And so it has always been unconstitutional. I cut deals. We had to re-sentence people. We had to refund money. We had to give up all kinds of resources. I've heard it's more than $100 million, this thing. And now you go to Seattle and places like that, and you see open drug use. We have it in Shelton, Washington, in our park. You can watch. I'm with the VFW. We go to our VFW hall, and because it's next to the park, there's needles all over the place and stuff like that. And then, I was reading another decision that just came out recently, the Callaway decision, where they bent over backwards to save a statute that they liked, a criminal statute that they liked. And you know what? Why is it that way? Why is the state Supreme Court that way? For 41 years, we've had only one party in the governor's mansion. So what happened was the governor kept appointing judges. So Oliver Wendell Holmes said the study of the law is the study of history. And I'm sure Dan will tell you this, you got to know your history if you are involved in drafting the laws, enforcing the laws, you got to know the history. So when Washington State was created, before it was a state, it was obviously a territory. And we had a territorial governor. So the governor had unilateral right to appoint judges. And they realized this was a bad thing because the judges were all his political friends. So they were concerned about corruption. They were concerned about favoritism. They were concerned about political decisions coming from the state Supreme Court. So they mandated in the Washington State Constitution that judges would be elected, that the people would decide. And so what happened, but they also put a clause in there, if there's a vacancy that arises, the governor could appoint, and then the person would have to stand for the next election. So what happened was, over the course of the 40 years that we've only had a certain party in the governor's mansion, is they decided, this is brilliant. Did you know that 70 to 80% of all the judges in Washington State are appointed? What happened was a tradition arose. The governor appoints you, and then before your term is up, you resign, and he appoints So all of you have voted in judge elections, and all you're going to get really is the pamphlet statement. And it's not going to say much, anything. It's going to say where we went to law school, you know, like I belong to Rotary, VFW, and things like that. And so you don't really have, and that's why we have so many undervotes in judicial elections, because people don't really have the information, because we're not allowed to take stats. I can't tell you how I would vote. The big thing is the income tax. I can't tell you what I think of that, you know, any of those decisions, because if I said what I thought about it, then I would be prejudging it. And I can't even do that as a trial court judge right now. I can't tell you how I think about certain things. But I bet if you were to ask law enforcement in Mason County, hey, Judge Stevens is on the criminal rotation. You think that guy's going to get out of jail this weekend? I bet he's not. Hey, you think he's going to have high bail? Yeah, I'm thinking he might. So what they're trying to do is the legislature passes a law, and it has to do with, say, you know, they passed a law, this was decades ago, saying that if you're a juvenile and you're, you know, being criminally prosecuted, you plead, you get put on probation, that judges can authorize a warrant. You know, so you got some kid who's got a drug problem or something like that. You wouldn't believe how many young women I would see come through the juvenile courts where older men got hooked on drugs. We all know why. And then, so what happened was when they pass a statute like that, the courts, we have to pass what's called the procedure, rules of criminal procedure, how we're going to implement what the legislature has passed. So what they decided was, you know what? We don't like the kids are getting arrested. We don't think kids should be in juvenile detention. So they said the only time we can issue a warrant now is when there's specialized danger. So say it's a kid that's 15 years old and this kid's going out and stealing cars all the time. I don't know. I think it's kind of dangerous for 15-year-olds to be going around stealing cars. It leads to looting cases, things like that. Plus, you know, they're not good drivers and things like that. But we can't issue a warrant because that would only be a general danger. It's not a specific danger to like an individual. So basically, we can't issue warrants. If they violated their probation, the fact that they're not going to get off drugs, that we know that they were suicidal or something like that, well, that's not a specialized danger. So no warrant for those kids. Basically eviscerated our ability to do warrants. Then they really offended me a few years ago. They decided that they thought that there was too much racism in our courts. So what it is they call it systemic racism. I don't know if anybody know what systemic racism is? That's when you really, really study the issue. You can't find any racism. Law enforcement officers, you know, there's always a few bad apples in any bunch, but I would say 99.9% of all law enforcement officers, no way they're racist. So they couldn't find any racists in the prosecutor's office. Sure, there's a few. Any large group, you're going to find some bad apples. They find it in the court system, but they don't like the outcomes, so they basically said the whole system is racist. So now, if you're a minority, and a racial or ethnic minority, and you come to be on a criminal jury trial, and you say, you know what, I don't trust law enforcement officers. I think law enforcement officers are all racist, and they're fabricating evidence, and I would never trust one. Well, if you're not a member of a minority, you get kicked off that jury panel right then and there. But if you're a minority, we're specifically precluded. Even though you're biased, you can't be kicked off the jury. Those are the kind of rules. Now they're proposing a rule where they basically get rid of our bail system, so there'd be no bail bondsmen. They want to destroy the criminal justice system. And that's why I'm running, because somebody needs to call them out. Somebody needs to tell people like you what's going on and what they're trying to do. So I ask for your support. I ask that you know, we have yard signs, we've got literature. Tell your friends, because I am willing to talk out about what they're doing. And I don't think you're going to find any other people running for a judge or for the state Supreme Court that's willing to call them out. And I agree with the previous speaker, we need to get out there and we need to actually address these problems. We can't just go, I'm going to be a good judge, I'm going to follow the rule of law. We actually need to address the problems that they're creating. Thank you.